Welcome to Religion Wise. I'm your host, Chip Gruen. If you listened to last month's episode, you'll remember that I talked with a group of local faith leaders who were part of the team that launched the Faith 250 Lehigh Valley Initiative. As I said then, I've attended a few of those events and did so again this last May. At that event, someone came up to me and introduced himself to me. It was today's guest, David Hunsicker. David worked for 2 decades at USAID as one of the foremost specialists on strategic religious engagement. He is also, as it turns out, a local to Lehigh Valley who went to the same high school, though sometime earlier, that my children went to. Talking with him at that Faith 250 event, I knew right away that he would be a great guest for our show. His work is exactly aligned with what we try to do, thinking about religion and the public conversation, and in this case, religion in government and public policy. He was instrumental in the 2023 policy that you'll hear us talk about today called Building Bridges in Development, a framework for U.S. government partnership with religious communities around the world. That work was done in his capacity as a civil servant at USAID, which of course, was closed in 2025 as a part of the DOGE initiative. So in our conversation today, we talk about that work, which for him spanned multiple administrations from both parties, and the abrupt closure of USAID. We also talk about how the work continues at Georgetown University's Berkley Center in a new strategic religious engagement hub, which tries to preserve some of the capacity that was lost last year. So this conversation is longer than our typical episode, but I promise it is worth it. It is fascinating to hear about this facet of government work that I didn't know existed in anything like the depth that David describes. Additionally, his personal biography, growing up in a Pennsylvania Dutch household, and then his educational and personal journey that lead him to his work both in Uzbekistan and then eventually into Washington, D.C., is super interesting as well. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with David Hunsicker. David Hunsicker, thanks for coming on Religion Wise.
It's great to be here, Chip. I really appreciate you inviting me.
So before we get into the work itself at USAID and the SRE, and we'll define all of our terms as we go, can you talk a little bit about how you got interested in international policy and thinking about religion as a serious object of study in the first place? What drew you into this work?
Sure. And a very logical question for sure. In terms of the policy side of it, I think that was a little bit more of a slow development. But when talking about religion, I have been fascinated by, interested in, and been a student of history for as long as I can remember. I grew up here in the Lehigh Valley, went to, Sunday school, like many kids do, and, enjoyed reading. And so one of the things I would routinely read was the Bible. And, I as I was reading the Bible, I was, became really interested in the stories, but it also produced a lot of questions. And so I went to try and find answers to those questions, both within the Bible itself, but then branching off and looking at other religions to see if I could find answers to my questions. And so, to make a long story relatively short, I had my own theological questions about Christianity that I had trouble reconciling. So I went looking for other religions or philosophies that could, help me understand the world around me and my place in it. So I studied Buddhism, I looked at communism, I, looked at all sorts of different faith traditions. And, my mom likes to say that, one of her happiest days in that part of my journey was when I burned the copy of the Satanic Bible that I had purchased. I was looking far and wide to try and find answers to my questions. And first time I read about Islam, the theology appealed to me, but then there were all these rules of, no drinking, no pork, no dating. And I'm like, no way. Like, who would sign up for something like that? And so continued my search. but still wasn't finding answers. So eventually I came back to looking at Islam and purchased a translation of the Quran from the local, I think it was, what was it even back then? It was before Barnes & Noble was like the only place you could go. It was another chain bookstore, which I'm honestly not remembering anymore, but I do remember that it was in the Whitehall Mall. So went in, bought a translation of the Quran, brought it home, started reading it, and I couldn't put it down. It answered directly almost every question that I had about the unity of God versus the Trinity, about the nature of Christ being fully human rather than divine. These were things that had weighed on me, and it provided a context for many of those rules that I had read about in my early exploration of Islam, and it helped to contextualize it within the broader prophetic history, going back to Abraham and Moses and the patriarchs of the Bible, as well as Christ and his role as a prophet and another prophet, Muhammad, coming after him. And it all made very logical sense to me. So at that point, I decided I wanted to become Muslim. Didn't know how to do that as a Pennsylvania Dutch kid growing up in Heidelberg Township, Lehigh County. And so just continued to read until I had the opportunity to be an exchange student in Turkey in my junior year of high school. So I went to Northwestern Lehigh High School, and the Rotary had its youth exchange program. One of my teachers, Fred Phillips, who's my biology teacher, was a member of the Rotary and encouraged me to take part. And I wanted to go to Germany because, like I said, I was a Pennsylvania Dutch kid, grew up in Heidelberg Township, wanted to learn German so that I could understand what my grandparents were saying behind my back, because we didn't grow up knowing Pennsylvania Dutch except passively. And so that exchange opportunity to go to Turkey allowed me to live separately from my family, grow as a Muslim independently with the guidance of a Turkish family who were religious in some ways, but very secular in others. That's the way Turkey was. It was much more secular in the 80s when I was there than it would become later. It's still very secular in a lot of ways, but that was a formative experience for me. And it was also formative for my parents in that they came at the end of that time for about 3 weeks. We traveled the country. They got to meet Muslims for the first time themselves. And it really helped to allay the fears that have been created for them by the media about Muslims and Islam and all that sort of thing. And so, my parents were extremely supportive of my conversion. Now, there was an element of, he was a Buddhist last week. He's a Muslim this week. We'll see what he is next week. But about 40 years in, I think they're pretty confident that it's going to stick. So that was, an important milestone in my personal development, to be sure. And specifically, the interest in religion didn't end there. I went to the University of Michigan to complete my bachelor's in Islamic studies because it was the only avenue I could figure out to learn more about Islam, again, in the late 80s, early 90s. And University of Michigan was the only undergraduate program in Islamic studies in the United States at that time. So, there were Near Eastern Studies, Middle Eastern Studies programs, but there wasn't a major in Islamic studies anywhere except the University of Michigan. So that's why I ended up there. Didn't start there, but that's where I ended up. Had a wonderful experience, but that really helped, give me a strong academic footing to go on. And then eventually, I didn't go straight into grad school. Came back to the Lehigh Valley for a while. Was working at a bookstore, just a stone's throw from here at Muhlenberg College. It was Encore Books over in the West End part of Allentown, and worked there for several years. And then also part-time, I was studying at Moravian Theological Seminary. And so I studied Hebrew and Greek, New Testament, and had an opportunity to be in an interfaith environment and really learn a lot from a lot of my peers who were going on to be pastors in various denominations of Protestant Christianity. And, that helped me learn a lot, and I gained a lot of really useful tools that would help me later on when I did go on to the University of Washington out in Seattle. That was one of just a few universities at the time that had a focus on the Turkic languages of Central Asia. Because when I graduated from college from the University of Michigan, it was soon after the wall had fallen. And, communism had collapsed in the Soviet Union. Newly independent states came into existence across the former Soviet Union. And I saw that as a niche area where I could, leverage my knowledge of Turkish that I had gotten from both my year in high school, but also what I continued to study as an undergraduate. So I decided to focus on Uzbek, which was one of the languages that was offered there because it's kind of analogous to Ottoman Turkish, except for Eastern Turkic literature. So it's a major literary language, very similar to Ottoman alongside Persian in Central Asia. Decided to focus on that. And so I then applied for a few fellowships. And at that time, there wasn't much competition. This was before 9/11. And so there were fellowships available. I applied for 2, got them both, was able to do them back to back. And that gave me 2 years of full-time study in Uzbekistan that I was able to do as a graduate student that provided an opportunity for real immersion in the language, do some pre-dissertation research for a dissertation that never got written because 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, some people that I knew at the embassy, including somebody I had actually studied a different Turkic language at a summer program at a different university, they reached out and they said, "Hey, Dave, we know that you have, contacts in the local Muslim community in Uzbekistan, and obviously this, horrible attack has happened in the United States, and we want to reach out and we want to reassure the local Muslim population here that any response that comes from the United States to that terrorist attack is not an attack on Islam or attack on Muslims, but it's aimed at the criminals who perpetrated the attacks of 9/11.
So let me take
That's
a little diversion here, because you've described an academic experience that doesn't seem super foreign to me or a lot of people who end up doing what I do in academia. You do the language study, you do the culture study. It was an Islamic studies rather than an international studies program. And then you get this call that's asking you to do really political work. I don't know. That's an interesting disconnect in your story, and I wonder if is it just that there was not a lot of people with any kind of footing in Uzbekistan, or is there something else that I'm not seeing here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and a very logical question. I think part of it you've already answered in that there were very few fluent Uzbek speakers among Americans in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was there. And there were even fewer who were observant Muslims who had, relationships with people in the religious hierarchy. And, Uzbekistan and the religious institutions in particular are very hierarchical. So, the neighborhood mosque that I went to was the mosque of the head imam of Tashkent, the capital. And I had, and I would routinely interact with others who were in the publishing industry, putting out articles about Islam in America. I'd written a few of those. So I was already kind of serving as an informal cultural bridge, like many academics do. And it was about the personal relationships I had too with the people at the embassy. And that was also a function of the fact that the embassy community was extremely small, right? Like the posting to Tashkent was, it's not what most people go into the Foreign Service for. A lot of people love postings like Tashkent because nobody else knows about all of the treasures that are there to be uncovered during a tour in a country like that, and it became much more of an attractive post to many people as the years went on. But at that time, relative, I don't want to call it a diplomatic backwater, but not a high priority for the United States diplomatic service,
right.
Until the events of 9/11,
Sure.
and that completely changed the dynamic. And they didn't have a whole lot of people that they could. The embassy staff were reaching out, but they understood that for them to reach out to a religious community that they didn't have more than just kind of formal, very kind of trying to think of what the best adjective would be, like the best. It's just very kind of formal and not personal relationships, and they knew personal relationships would help.
Yeah.
We all know, like as we network for a job or whatever, personal relationships are important. And for something that was such high stakes, they wanted to take advantage of the personal relationships they knew about. Like they were going to do the outreach anyway, but they wanted to leverage my, personal relationships. And I was happy to do it because it was, I was horrified by the attacks of that day, as other Americans, Peace Corps volunteers in particular, found out about it. They reached out to me because they knew I had a television that had CNN, and they didn't. Oftentimes they were living with Uzbek families, and they didn't have international news or whatever, and so they were calling me. So I had a whole living room full of Peace Corps volunteers, right after 9/11, because everybody wanted the news and they weren't able to necessarily get it. So it's that small community of Americans who were all, experiencing this together. And, I wanted to get back to my country, recognizing that I could have a role. And so that was the first opportunity. And then the career comes after that.
Yeah. So you spent 8 years, is that right? Living and working in Uzbekistan?
7 years in Uzbekistan, 1 year in Kazakhstan. But yeah.
And so that experience, we've talked, I love the academic experience, right? I think a lot can happen on a campus, but obviously something different is happening for you in those 7+1 years. What did you learn there, aside from the personal relationships, aside from, that kind of asset that you gained in that time? What were the kinds of things that, in retrospect, you learned that helped you build your career?
I think the main thing I learned was the value of listening. You go as an academic, you have your topic that you want to research, and you go and you start doing the work around that. And, it can be a very linear process if you let it be, and you miss a lot of the context and the nuance. And, I went with a topic that I thought I was going to find a fair amount of primary source material on, and I didn't find that. And so I had to explore a bit, both in terms of, the academic topics that I was going to, be looking at as a part of a potential dissertation, and just spend time talking with people to figure out, like, okay, what is out there? If it's not this, how about this? And I got relationships as part of that. It also helped me learn about myself and what really interested me. One of the reasons I never completed my PhD was the realization that I had that I didn't want to be pigeonholed as an 18th century Uzbek literature scholar. That wasn't my happy place. Like, I went into academia I realized as a vehicle towards satisfying my intellectual curiosity, but it wasn't really about publishing or the research. I mean, I love the research, and I'm a lifelong learner, and I just came from the Lehigh County Heritage Museum, where I was in the library doing some local history research. Like it never stops. But it really wasn't what I wanted to spend the next 30 or 40 years of my life doing. It was an interesting topic. It allowed me a vehicle to, explore Uzbekistan, explore Central Asia, explore different options. And one of the things I realized really interested me was this idea of diplomatic engagement, and particularly public affairs, cultural exchange and engagement and that sort of thing, which I didn't know existed prior to that. I thought, the Foreign Service, the diplomatic service, whatever, they write treaties and, they have soirees where they, heads of state meet with ambassadors, and that's all it was. But the whole side of kind of public diplomacy was something I didn't know existed. And I became introduced, through my time there. And, I realized that a big part of that, like I said, was listening and just spending time with people and learning about what their concerns were, and then finding the common interest between what, the United States was hoping to accomplish through its diplomatic engagements and what people's bread and butter everyday concerns were.
As an aside, I will just say that there is more than one way to revolt against academia. And another way that one might revolt is by agreeing to become the director of an institute in which you do a podcast and public events, and you get to have lots of interesting conversations with lots of different kind of people, and you don't get pigeonholed. But that's just between you and me.
Yeah, fair enough.
So going back to your story then, you finish up your work in Central Asia, and then you come back to DC to join what became the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention.
Yeah.
And that work seems to be a shift in your career, whereas previously it was the Islamic studies centered, regional expertise. And you move to something that starts to look more like an interest in religious engagement more generally as a practice, as something that might be useful in that policy sphere. So first, do I get that right? And two, can you talk about that shift?
Yeah, so it's not as much a shift as it is a bridge that we've kind of skipped over in the story so far. So like I said, I did that outreach for the embassy initially, and, I was doing a favor, didn't know, where that was going to lead. And then an opportunity came up where a friend of mine was leaving a position in the public affairs section at the embassy, where he was managing a small grants program to civil society organizations in Uzbekistan. Many of them were human rights organizations. Uzbekistan at that time, unfortunately, had a very poor human rights record. That has changed, significantly. Uzbekistan is one of the few countries that went from a very short time of having been a country of particular concern for international religious freedom, according to the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, to getting off that list completely. And, that's an incredible accomplishment and a credit to, the Uzbek government for, making that significant a change. And, religious freedom has really blossomed in Uzbekistan. No country's perfect. Uzbekistan still has, some real estate to cover, in terms of improvements, but, we have plenty of problems here in the United States as well. So anyway, I had the opportunity to apply and then got selected to be in this public affairs role, which, like I said, was about human rights primarily, but also other civil society engagement. I did that for about a year and a half, and it was a really great opportunity for me to kind of, bridge my interests academically and be able to, work with local organizations. While that was taking place, Congress was slowly doing its thing in response to 9/11. And the way Congress generally reacts to anything is to appropriate money to things that they feel are important. And one of the things that Congress thought was important was religious engagement. And so there were some supplemental appropriation bills that were passed that had some really kind of generalized language about doing more in terms of outreach, including to religious communities in Central Asia. And so the embassy received these funds. USAID received part of them, and they looked at the pot of money and said, "What do we do with this?" Because we don't have a whole lot of experience or people who are trained in this. And they looked at some university partnerships as a possibility. They, looked at contracting it out. Eventually, what they decided was, let's take some of this money and we'll hire someone whose job it is to think about this, full time. And so they put out a solicitation for a religion, state, and society specialist. And it was a perfect fit for both my interests and my background at that point. I applied and was hired into that role, which I did for 3 years. And it was a regional position that had me working in all 5 of the Central Asian republics, in addition to Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. It was, the engagements weren't all equal. Turkmenistan remains a highly authoritarian state. And so it was very difficult to do work there, both then and, I imagine it would be now. But Kyrgyzstan, on the other hand, was in a phase of liberalization. And so there was a lot more opportunity to do things there. So I spent a lot of time going to Kyrgyzstan and working with communities there. And so, for 3 years, I full-time was sitting down with religious leaders of all sorts, not just Muslim religious leaders. It was very important, that we make sure that we're not just preferencing one community over another. Numerical majority of Muslims across all 5 of those countries. So yes, that's probably where the majority of our engagement was taking place. But, we made a good faith effort to engage the Russian Orthodox Church, for example. Political dynamics being what they are, they weren't always the easiest group to engage, but we engaged the Jewish community, Baha'is, others, and, really spent a lot of time looking for opportunities where, we could partner with these communities on areas of common interest. And, so I really developed kind of my, real world expertise in doing this kind of work, in those 3 years. That was the foundational, period that I would go on to build my career with USAID back in Washington when I left Central Asia.
Okay, so let's fast forward to then, right? So we get to the USAID, portion of your career, and in particular, we need to talk about the strategic religious engagement policy that you, as a part of a team, created while in USAID. And just to sort of anticipate where we're going, I want to talk about that. But I also just want to say this is one of the initiatives, one of the things that we have lost in the last year or so as USAID's funding was cut. So I just want to sort of put that out there, that what we're talking about now is something that we had capacity in as a government, as a country, but are now talking about sort of in the past tense, but not 100%. Right?
Correct.
All right. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the relationship between the strategic religious engagement policy. So if you're taking notes at home, this would be SRE, is I'm sure an acronym we will end up using, and its relationship in the larger framework of the USAID universe.
So in terms of, my journey, some family, I would have stayed in Central Asia probably for several more years. Some family medical issues required that I come back to the United States. And I didn't have anything lined up at USAID or elsewhere when I came back. But within a few months, a I was able to connect with some old colleagues. There was an opening in what was then the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at USAID, which was a great fit. They, wanted somebody that had, experience doing religious engagement. A lot of the work that I was doing in Central Asia also had an element of countering violent extremism and, looking at, are there ways that we can partner with communities to build resilience against extremism? Because that was, obviously part of the reaction to 9/11, right? So they were looking for people that had that kind of background, but not only that, most of what the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, did in those years was a lot around land conflicts and, natural resource conflicts across Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. So it wasn't just this kind of extremism angle, but that was one concern. And also, religious engagement wasn't only concerned with extremism either, right? So looking at the ways in which, we can partner with religious actors around land disputes or, herders and pastoralists and farmers and, all those, different folks. There's a religious element. You look at Nigeria where you have different groups that are, the farmers are, predominantly Christian and the pastoralists are, predominantly Muslim, and that leads to, kind of these resource conflicts. They have this religious overlay. So that holistic kind of view of things. So I came in, and one of the things we started working on was a toolkit, because there was, a regular set of requests that would come in of okay, we're working on these pastoralist farmer conflicts. How do we address them? Do you have a template? Do you have an example of something we can do? So another colleague had actually taken the lead on pulling something together before I joined the office. And so we started working very collaboratively together to pull something together, which was a toolkit on religion, conflict, and peace building that we were able to put out in about 2009. We started developing a training, programming in religious contexts that was kind of a companion to that. We were working with a lot of academics in the Washington, D.C. area who are part of an advisory board. Muhammad Abu Nimr, who was at American University, an expert in Islamic peace building. Mark Gopin at George Mason University was also part of our advisory board. And, they worked with us, to review the toolkit, to help us develop elements for the training. And we realized that, while we started out thinking about conflict, the need was even much broader than that, because there, people in various sectors of USAID, whether it be economic growth or health or, water and sanitation and all of the different sectors that USAID worked in, there was a religious element that would occasionally come up, more prominent in some places than others. And people weren't always prepared to deal with that element in their work. And so as part of the programming and religious context training, we wanted folks to just develop a basic comfort with engaging religious topics, and recognizing that, the separation between church and state, or religion and state, that, was the bedrock upon, which we worked, wasn't necessarily a barrier to the success of working with communities where religion had an important role, but actually was liberating, because it helped us to know that we could understand religious communities, but we didn't have a role in religion. It's not the job of USAID or the US government to be involved in religion, particularly outside of our own borders, right? We're not there to define how anybody believes or practices, and that's embedded in our Constitution, and that's something we applied internationally as well. But it did create, difficulty for some foreign service officers and others who were brought up on, this basic premise of that church and state are separate, and that we have taboos in America. You don't talk about religion and politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? And so getting over some of those inhibitions about even talking about or religion or with religious leaders was really the starting point that we embarked from. And so we made good progress, funding cycles being what they were. It was ebbs and flows, and every new administration had, different priorities. For some, religion was something that was of importance and would get prioritized, and at other times it wasn't. Individual members of leadership also would prioritize it over the other. We kind of kept on chugging along and, doing what we could as a small office in a big bureaucracy, having partners at different places within the government. One of the key events that took place in 2013 really started a few years earlier than that, but the Obama administration put together an interagency group that developed a strategy on religious leader and faith community engagement. I think that's the formal title. Something along the formal title is slightly different,
right?
But it was the first time, really that the U.S. government came out with any kind of. It wasn't a policy, but it was a strategy for engaging religious actors. Now, the Department of Defense was a little bit ahead. They had been leveraging the chaplain corps, and they had developed doctrine for the chaplains to be able to do more outreach-like activities, as part of their mission. But honestly, the chaplains also turned to us and said, can you help us, think through some of these issues, as we go about implementing it? Because the chaplains, when they were recruited into the military, were there for the troops. They didn't have as part of their mandate, doing engagement with other faith groups, outside of, the troops that they were responsible for. So it was a learning curve for them as well. So we had this, kind of interagency, opportunity to learn and grow from one another and fill one another's gaps. And that came out in the 2013 strategy initially.
So let me just interject real quick. Sure. I just want to put in a little if you didn't know it, to some of our listeners. One of the things that has really shocked me, thinking about religion, and you and I think about religion like you can have a conversation about religion without it being a religious conversation, right? We sort of share that view. One of the things that I've been just really surprised at over the years is how forward thinking the military is on this topic, because they have to be knowledgeable about their theaters that they're in order to respond to the humans that they encounter in those theaters. I ran across, it was from one of the service academies, but a syllabus on understanding religion, for officers in training. And it just blew me away at actually how enlightened it was. Now, maybe not for purposes that all of us would all be very happy with, right? But the idea of that sort of ability to have kind of a critical distance is shockingly present in the military. So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, and my experience has been, that, the military, they're mission driven, of course, right? And then they're given a mission. That mission sometimes requires the use of lethal force. But my experience of working with the military is that they do everything that they possibly can to avoid getting to that point where they need to use lethal force. And one of the advantages they find from doing religious engagement is that it, protects the troops. It creates relationships that allow them to have a more constructive interaction with the communities in which they're working, so that they don't have to use lethal force. And when they do, it's much more restrained and constrained than perhaps it otherwise would be. And that's one of the reasons, too, why they, liked working with USAID. USAID routinely partnered with the military. I spent 6 months in Afghanistan, embedded in a military unit at ISAF headquarters, NATO headquarters, as International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, where my role was as a development advisor, including on religious engagement issues. And they're like a sponge. Like, the military is constantly learning, and they know that first and foremost they want to protect the troops, and they also want to protect life in the communities in which they have to operate.
So one of the results of all of this is the Building Bridges and Development document that you shared with me, and we can put a link to that in the show notes. It's available. And it has this framework incorporated in it that is the Bridges framework. So I'm just going to run through what that is real quick. We don't have time to go through every one of them, but I want to introduce it. So Bridges is an acronym that stands for belonging, respect, integrity, dignity, growth, equity, and sustainability. So obviously these are the values that you wanted to have as a part of this work about the strategic religious engagement. So I've got follow-up here, but I just want to sort of start with, can you talk about that framework and how it was received and what it accomplished for you?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, in terms of how it was developed, like I mentioned, the 2013 strategy, one of the constraints around that was that it was cost neutral. That was the orders that came down from on high in the Obama administration. Like, you can come up with a strategy, but you can't spend any new money on it. So that was a significant constraint. But the State Department was really able to build out its capacity, and they developed an Office of Religion and Global Affairs through the late Obama years, and it would continue into the Trump administration, first Trump administration, although it soon, was ratcheted back in the first Trump administration. But while that was happening simultaneously at USAID, our Office of the Center for, the names change all the time, so this is why I'm like pausing. Like, what was it called at that time? Mm-hmm. It was the Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives, which these centers have been established across the federal government and the George W. Bush administration. So while the Religion and Global Affairs Office at the State Department was shrinking, we had leadership at USAID that was prioritizing it, and so our Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives was growing. And so what had just been a 1 or 2 person shop with temporary staff, like foreign service officers who were coming through every 2 years, and it started to grow and get more of an infrastructure under the leadership of Kirsten Evans, who was the director at that time, and our administrator, Green. And so it was under their enlightened leadership that we're really starting to grow things and realizing that, okay, we can talk about religious engagement, but we also need an evidence base. So invested in convening an evidence summit, bringing academics and practitioners and others together to really look at what do we know about religious engagement, what works, what doesn't, what are the lessons that we've learned from doing this, often in an ad hoc way across the U.S. government, but also what other governments and non-governmental organizations have been doing. So this evidence summit was convened, and papers were commissioned, which I would also recommend reading. And those are published and available online. Happy to share those for the show notes. But it really provided a strong intellectual basis, for what we wanted to do. 2013 strategy was great, but it was a lot of policymakers who had experience, but were sitting in a room coming up with ideas that they thought were good. This helped to provide a stronger evidence base for what we were going to do moving forward. So that was toward the end of the first Trump administration. When administrations changed, the new Biden administration took over, they wanted to continue the work. And, everybody was in agreement. Like, this was really a bipartisan consensus that the work that was done, in the last administration on this topic was solid. It wasn't politicized, And it's something that we needed to continue to build upon. And that's exactly what we did. We took that learning and, added to it and developed this policy on strategic religious engagement, which we named Bridges to Development, or Building Bridges in Development. And, nothing happens in government without there being a cute acronym associated with it. And so we had lots of discussions about, what is the essence of what we want to convey. We came up with different lists of values. And then we realized that a few of them probably could be transformed into a nice acronym. And that's how, we came up, with the Bridge framework, Bridges framework. And we did kind of shoehorn a few different things under some categories in order to make the acronym work.
It's awfully cute.
But you can remember it, right?
Yes.
Right? It's not just SRE, strategic religious engagement. That's, it rolls off the tongue because it's short, but Bridges is something you can remember, and it evokes an image because it's really the core of what we want to do. SRE is all about building bridges. And we, both, metaphorically, but also literally, right? Mm-hmm. When you're talking about development work and you need to, work with the community, perhaps to build a physical bridge over two sides of a river to unite communities that maybe are in conflict, and you want to get them cooperating, it's real bridge building as well as the metaphoric bridge building. And that really was the essence of it. And if I were to boil down, those different categories that you rattled off, it's really about two things. It's about radical empathy, and it's about do no harm. And ideally, so that you can do maximum good. And so all of those different categories, contribute to, those basic values that we put forward in the framework. And, just thinking about belonging and, making sure that people are inclusive when they're doing the work, and, making sure that, nobody's being excluded. I talked about earlier, like working in a Muslim majority environment, but we wanted to make sure that other communities didn't think, oh, well, this is just about the Muslims. They only care about 9/11. They only care about extremists, and they're going to reach out to the Muslim community, and they don't care about us or our concerns. And similarly, those within the Muslim community who would say they only care about extremism, they don't actually care about, our lives, or, making sure that everybody feels a sense of belonging, and it's a shared effort that's inclusive and listening to everybody. So, making sure that, we're respecting people's inherent dignity and not just reaching out to them because we have an objective. We as the U.S. government, yes, we're going to have our mission, we're going to have our objectives, and we're going to have certain things that we need to get done. But we don't need to do that in a way that instrumentalizes a community or an individual as a vehicle just to get done what we want to get done. We rather, it's to form a partnership and a relationship that's authentic and that, goes both ways. Like, okay, we need something that perhaps we want help with, and hopefully the objectives overlap, that we can, do something that is going to achieve goals for both the communities as well as the U.S. government. But sometimes it's about being there and listening and finding out, this is really what the community wants or needs. And are there ways that we can help them with that? And, just being active listeners and, giving them the agency of, being an active partner in the ongoing conversation and discussion. And like I said, having real authentic relationships that, aren't just about us using one another for our short-term transactional needs.
So here's my question. And I'm not going to state this eloquently, but when you look at these values, so you talked about belonging, right, and inclusion is sort of some of the values that are there, and you described it as of various religious communities or various factions in religious communities. When I first read this document, and this is addressed elsewhere in the document, but I want to get you to address it here. When I hear belonging and inclusion, there's a lot of gender, race, ethnicity, etc., that carries with it sort of more progressive values that we traditionally have held, right? Not everybody all the time,
Absolutely.
but even moderate or center right, people would adhere to, that get exported with our foreign policy. And if you're talking about respect and the dignity of religious communities who might have very firmly held beliefs about exclusion of particular identities, those seem to clash to me, right? How does this framework deal with those sorts of more progressive values that often come with U.S. public policy and the traditional values that might be really, really sincerely held within the communities you're dealing with?
Yeah, no, great question. And, it's not an easy question to answer, of course, because it's messy, right? And that's humanity. Humanity is messy, but that's also the fun part of the job is, trying to navigate through that mess and find where the common ground actually is. Because, you can be in a variety of environments where, it's going to be really hard to have conversations around, gender questions. And there are times when, it's a policy priority that U.S. government may have about making sure that, there are women at the table. And, that's the right thing to do to make sure that there's, all voices represented, or at least, all genders represented. But at the same time, that may not be the norm in the society in which we're working, right? And so, how do we navigate that? It's sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? And it's having some initial engagements that prepare the ground. It's not just showing up and saying, we're going to have a meeting with 12 religious leaders, and we're going to require that 4 of them be women, right? Or 6 and 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're dealing with a patriarchal religious structure, you have to figure out ways in which, you're able to bring in those voices. And sometimes, like in places in Afghanistan, where, recognizing, I don't want to overgeneralize, right? Like Afghanistan has a very rich and varied history. And if you, look back at the 60s, Afghanistan and Kabul in particular, some of the gender norms were very different than what we see today, much more progressive, but not across the board, right? So, thinking about, are there ways where, maybe the women aren't comfortable going into that patriarchal environment and, trying to assert their voices? Some very well may be, but others, because of this societal context, may not. And so having an opportunity where they can express their views separately from those male religious leaders, that can be somehow then brought into the conversation where they feel free to speak, in that cultural environment. And then, have that be brought into the conversation. Now, is that the way we would approach it as 21st century Americans? Most likely not, right? But we're Americans. They're not. And we have to make sure that we're being respectful of the way that their society, their culture deals with some of these questions. And it's not going to be a one-to-one match. And it's going to be a constant negotiating and renegotiating those conversations and relationships. And part of what we were trying to get across in the Bridges policy is, use these principles to navigate that messiness as best you can. You're never going to get it perfect. You're never going to get it 100% right, because as soon as you try doing something, there's going to be a ripple effect that, is going to perhaps derail what you were trying to do as well. And so you're going to have to re-examine it, redo it again. And it's a living process. But if you have certain principles that can guide you, those principles can help see you through some of that messiness and, kind of give you that North Star that you need to navigate it. And like I said, at the core, it's about radical empathy and it's about doing no harm. And, if we can keep those two things in mind as we negotiate through or navigate through some of these stickier questions, we'll know when to push and we'll know when to pull back. And sometimes, what I did as part of my work was to go to the American policymakers and say, you can't do that. You're going to, damage your reputation more by pushing on whatever issue it is than by, recognizing that there's a difference of opinion here. And we need to find where the common ground is, where we can agree to disagree and still accomplish all of the other things that we can do together. So I always said, we'll talk to anybody who will talk to us as long as they're not, on a, terrorist list or something like that. We have to be willing to engage with those who don't share our views if we want to make progress in, perhaps changing their views. But we also have to be able to listen and understand where they're coming from and recognizing that maybe the way that we're doing things isn't right for their society or their country.
So thinking about, that common ground that you just mentioned, something that I like to think a lot about, and we do a lot at the Institute, and people who are listeners of Religion Wise or attendees at our Worldview sessions will see this is sort of shot through our work, that we're really interested in attending to difference. And that the work that you describe on a policy landscape, and also I think the traditional work of interfaith engagement, is about common denominators, looking for similarity, looking for common ground, looking for places where those connections can be made, as opposed to a more academic perspective that always wants to sort of stress difference, right? Doesn't want to collapse difference as sort of less significant or less important. Can you talk about that tension? Can you talk about how that shows up in the work that you've done?
Yeah. In terms of, trying to find that common ground, anytime you're dealing with policy issues, there tends to be a black, a white, and a gray in between, right? And there are strong opinions on all sides of an issue, and sometimes we default to being on opposite sides, black and white. It's this way or that way. But if we really want to get things accomplished, it's usually best to explore the gray. And so I think if you want to be action-oriented, you have to default towards leaning into that gray area and trying to find within that where the overlap is, where the common ground is. And so as a practitioner, that's what we were trying to do in USAID. Like I said earlier, we weren't just about the peace building or even the simplistic, contact theory peace building. If you know the other side, you're less likely to think negatively of them. But what does that mean in practice? Where are you actually going to collaborate? Where are you going to work together to, bring clean water to the community that is divided in other ways? And so emphasizing that common ground is important, but also having a really keen understanding of what the differences are. Because that goes to the do no harm element that I was talking about earlier, is yes, there are differences, and you can't just paper over them. You can't pretend they don't exist, because that creates the potential that you're going to do something that inflames the situation. By ignoring difference, you are, creating the greater potential for damage that can be done. So, we need to, yes, identify, that common ground that falls between that, stark black and white. But we also have to understand what those outer parameters are, so that we aren't inadvertently bumping up against them and, doing something that's really going to inflame things. So I think both are incredibly important, understanding that difference. And, as academics do, like really studying what is it that divides, this set of beliefs or values or people. And, yet what are the things that make us all human? What are those common, elements that we all need in our lives? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, sure. Right? Like we could all share. And, a lot in terms of a lot of the peace building work that I did, including like with Israelis and Palestinians, a lot of it was work with youth, because people can agree that kids deserve to be happy, deserve to have a good future, and to have a peaceful future. So even if the present isn't any of those things, that people will invest in their kids, and they understand why other people would want to invest in their kids as well. And it really creates a lot of common ground. So, that's something that, I did a lot of work in over my, years, particularly in Washington, D.C., with the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, later the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention.
So just a little editorial note here. One of the things that I sort of am writing about now and thinking about now is that what you describe as the gray, that common ground that I've described also as being a part of the interfaith world, tends to be where the public discourse is, to the exclusion of the thing that I probably mistakenly called academic, because I think that should be part of the public discourse as well, right? Really having religious literacy, really understanding difference. So I guess my goal at the Institute is to sort of make more public the idea that understanding difference is as important as understanding similarity.
Yeah, no, I that makes a lot of sense. And like I said, from my perspective, if you don't understand that difference, you're not going to be successful. You may be successful in the short term, or you may have, like boiling things down to the least common denominator, is nice. It's a starting point, but oftentimes you never get past that point if you're not engaging the difference as well.
And I would also say that when you do then have the inevitable sort of tragedy, then people look across the table at one another and say, I don't know who you are. Yeah. I thought I did, but I don't, which we've seen examples of.
Absolutely.
In the very recent past. Yes. So we had nodded to this earlier, but now we're going to take it on straight on. USAID was effectively closed last July. And with it, much of the infrastructure, the work that you spent your career building, the policy statements, was effectively sidelined. Can you talk about, you don't need to talk about the nitty gritty of the logistics of that, but can you talk about what was lost when that agency was closed?
Yeah. I think it's going to take us years to fully appreciate what was lost. Careers were lost, but in the larger scheme of things, that's not the biggest tragedy. People will go on, they'll pick up their lives, they'll find new careers. But the lives impacted around the world, the goodwill that was lost among communities around the world, the USAID's slogan was "From the American People." And, we emphasize that all the time because the United States makes foreign policy mistakes on a pretty regular basis that cause ill will towards the United States. And the work that USAID was doing, as well as, colleagues at the State Department and public diplomacy sphere and political realm as well, it helps to really establish that the United States is not just a series of mistakes, but it's a series of constructive engagements that we do engage communities in to improve their lives so that they have more stable and prosperous countries and societies, which then also help us to have more stable and prosperous trading partners and allies. And it makes the world and it makes the United States more safe, more secure, more prosperous. And, if we think about, we all have experienced firsthand, it's difficult oftentimes for people, why would U.S. taxpayer money go overseas to, help, the health infrastructure of a country overseas, or, help with the education of another country, when we have our problems at home. First thing to understand is that it's less than 1% of the federal discretionary budget that is going to these efforts. So, and that includes all of the embassies that, help you if you're traveling overseas and you lose your passport or you need a ticket home, or, all of that's within that less than 1%. And in addition, we're engaging communities around the world in these ways. It's a tiny sliver of what goes into the defense budget. And, General Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense in the first Trump administration, they talked about cutting USAID and, diplomatic initiatives. And he said, well, you better buy me more bullets then, because that's what it's going to require. So we, by cutting back on, these constructive engagements we have overseas, it makes us more vulnerable. And, as I started to say, we all have experience with what happened with COVID. COVID didn't begin here in the United States. It began overseas in Wuhan. We can, debate naturally occurring or, conspiracy theories about labs and, what have you. The bottom line is it started outside of the United States and it came to the United States and it impacted all of our lives. Lots of lives were lost here domestically. Our economy was disrupted, and we're still, getting back from, bouncing back from COVID. Similarly, I used to work for Admiral Ziemer, who was the Ebola advisor. And Admiral Ziemer, he had been doing work, on Ebola early warning and in dealing with Ebola outbreaks in Africa. And then he came over to USAID and continued to do some of that work and did other preventative work. That's all about keeping problems from ever reaching our shores. And some of that may be medical, some of that may be political, because if we have disgruntled people in countries around the world who are being oppressed, their human rights are being violated by their governments, and they see the United States government as being an ally with those authoritarian governments, that puts us at risk, because now we're in the crosshairs of those who want to lash out. And it's about building constructive relationships. And I think that's essentially what has been lost, is our ability to have some of those constructive engagements at the community level and not just at the levels of, governments and leaders, but really engaging communities, because people recognize the USAID logo, the two clasped hands of cooperation, with that slogan of "from the American people," and they understood what that meant, even if they didn't agree with everything else we were doing. But that appealed to people. It created relationships and friends that we were able to engage as part of our own protection of the homeland by making sure that, we had partners when an Ebola outbreak happened, that we were able to, spot it, start to treat it at its source before it ever reached our shores. Or what I worked on was the conflict and violence prevention, helping communities deal with the issues that they were grappling with so that they didn't fester and become something destabilizing in their country that would then drive migration, that would drive terrorism, that would drive civil unrest that impacts not just that country, but, Europe, the United States, and elsewhere.
So there is, this is sort of a silver lining, I suppose, that a lot of the people who were affected by the USAID closure, and specifically were involved with the strategic religious engagement policy, have tried to maintain capacity for this work. I sort of say in exile. I don't know if that's the right term or not. At Georgetown University, can you tell us about the Strategic Religious Engagement Hub at the Berkley Center at Georgetown, and how that project emerged, and what is it doing, and what does it look like in its current form?
Sure. So at the end of the Biden administration, we knew that there were going to be changes with the incoming Trump administration. That was no secret. And we were trying to position ourselves to best, answer what we thought the Trump administration's priorities were going to be. And so one of the last tasks I had was actually working with the then director for the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, as was then called, Professor Peter Mandeville, who is a professor at George Mason University, as well as affiliated with the Berkley Center at Georgetown University. He has spent time in the State Department, was with USAID at the end of the Biden administration. And he and I together had gone to Jerusalem, Israel, the West Bank, and, we're trying to develop a handover memo of areas where we thought the incoming Trump administration was going to be able to, continue to build upon engagements with religious communities in the Holy Land. And, recognizing that October 7th had happened, the war in Gaza was ongoing, to explore areas where, they could continue to build on that. So, like I said, we knew that there were going to be changes. We were trying to prepare for those changes. We didn't recognize the full scale of what was to come. So, when not just USAID, but also the U.S. Institute for Peace was also shuttered, and bureaus within the State Department were similarly downsized or eliminated, including the unit for strategic religious engagement, as well as the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the State Department. A lot of these entities that have been working in this religious engagement space, when they were eliminated, we quickly realized that something needed to be done in order to preserve, what we had learned over, the last several decades of trying to do this work. And it really was Peter, who, like I said, I was working very closely with at USAID at the end of the Biden administration, who leveraged, his academic positions to be able to really pivot and develop kind of a repository for the documents that were being erased, because they were literally being erased. And, but thankfully nothing really dies in the internet, right? So, things were able to be recovered, and, some of the documents have been, put on a repository, but also looking at, okay, where is the human capital that can be, brought into this effort and engaged, so that we can think about, all right, when there will be a change in the policy, whether it's under the current Trump administration or a future Democratic or Republican administration, our experience has shown that to be successful in our diplomatic, our military, and our development objectives, we need to be engaging religious actors. And, that's, what some of us have spent decades trying to do. And we're going to be back doing it again because religion is an important part of the human experience. And religion isn't going away anytime soon. If you look at, polling across the globe of the importance of religion in people's lives, those indicators are only going up in many countries. There are some places that maybe, Western Europe and other places that may be going in the opposite direction. But, even the United States is an outlier in terms of religiosity. Americans may not be as attached to specific denominations or organized religion in the way they were, but they're still very spiritual. And a lot of people do identify with organized religion in ways that Western Europe does not. And in the rest of the world, religion never stopped being an important factor. So if we want to, be successful in trade, we want to be successful in our diplomatic engagements, we want to be successful in having allies in our times of need, then we're going to need to continue to engage religious actors and of all sorts, whether they be hierarchical religious leaders or grassroots individuals and communities that identify themselves religiously. We're going to need to be there and have a capacity to engage them. So we need to, maintain what we can for that future. And so that's what the Strategic Religious Engagement SRE Hub is set up to do under the leadership of Dr. Mandeville, but with a robust advisory board of former policymakers and practitioners who have been doing this for a long time, both Democrats and Republicans, and lots of independents who, will continue to contribute to this effort, knowing that, if we want the United States to be prepared for a world in which religion matters, we need to have these resources available to us.
So the question I always like to close by asking is, what am I leaving out? What is the important thing that we should be talking about that I haven't addressed with you today?
First and foremost, I do want to state that, anything I say or said in the course of, this conversation are my personal opinions and based on my personal experience, and is in no way reflective necessarily of views of current or past government agencies, including USAID. You can read the policy speaks for itself, but, my reflections here are mine and mine alone. I do want to state that. In terms of what's being left out, I mean, there's so many, granular details that we could go into and, tons of stories I wish we had the time to tell. But I don't know that there's anything really that we've really left out in terms of the big picture. I'm sure as soon as I step away from this interview, something will come to mind that I wasn't able to cover. But yeah, for right now, I think we've covered a lot of real estate.
Well, I always say these conversations are the beginning of our relationship, not the end of it. So when you have amassed, all of those stories or the things that you forgot to talk about, we can come back and we can rejoin the conversation.
I look forward to it.
David Hunsicker, thank you so much. This has been great. I feel like I didn't know you personally, but honestly, I didn't know the extent to which this kind of work was being done on behalf of the American people. And so I thank you for your work, and I hope you get to do more of it in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
This has been Religion Wise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. Religion Wise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to Religion Wise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.